Hello and welcome to the third tutorial on how to program in C# using Windows formats. Now, if you remember from the last tutorial, we covered how we can get user input to display on the screen, and we enter into our text box. That's just running, that is. We'll get a little thing that pops up and tells what we've entered. This one only works with numbers though, just be aware of that. Now, if we go back to the code, which is just over here, it's the code that sends out our little message with the number. If we go in here and make a few spaces, I'm going to run you guys through something a little bit different. So if you look at this line of code here, we have something called a variable. Now a variable is a bit like a box. It essentially stores all the values that we find important inside of this box. So for instance, in the case of my number, whatever user you enter to the screen is then stored inside my number, and we can then do other operations with my number. So I'm going to comment out this line first, and we just do /, and that comments that out. Commenting out literally just means that it becomes a comment, and a comment doesn't have any effect on your program. It never gets processed. It's just there for our own, our own understanding of what's happening normally. But in this case, we're just trying to blank out what's happening here. Now, there are several different data types of variables, because everything that you store in a variable must have its own data type. In this case, I'm going to show you some of the more basic ones we've got. So, first one is Boolean, or bool variable. Second one is integer. Next one is float. And the last one I'm going to do is double. Actually, I'll put in a string as well, why not? Now, be aware, the naming I've used here is not ideal. We normally wouldn't call them these particular names, but we're just doing that now so it's a bit easier to envision what they are. So there's three parts to every variable. There's the data type, which is the first bit you see. The second word is the name. This could be absolutely anything. I call it Boolean variable, and call it Boolean variable 1, Boolean variable 2. I call it, Mount Everest. It would still be a name we can refer to for that particular variable. Normally it's best to give it a descriptive name. So if I'm doing something to control, say a program's flow, I might say, is program running? Something like that. Something simple, something to the point. The third bit here is where we assign something to it. So in this case we're saying the bowling variable will equal false. Now that could change depending on the data type, but in the case of a Boolean variable it is just true or false. Now each of these different data types takes a different type of data into it. A Boolean variable is true or false. Integer is a whole number. A float is a number with decimal points, but less so than double, which is a number with decimal points which has extra values onto it, so you get an increased precision. Normally you could use either. It's only if it comes to mathematical problems you want to use a double, really, but again you can use either. String is text. Now you can't implicitly convert one variable to another in C#. which means you can't just say my integer equals true or false, because that won't work. But you can do a conversion. So what we've done here previously in our old bit of code, we converted our user entry to an integer. So we know we can convert them as long as it's logical to do so. The important thing is that you use variables for the job they're intended for. So in this case, let's make another integer. Now be aware that the first thing that you're doing here is called the declaration for a variable. So we're saying a variable called my number exists of type int. We then initialize it by giving it a 0 value. So this bit is called the initialization of the variable. So we provide the initial value the variable will contain. Now if we add a second my number, add a 1 to the first one, and then make it my number 2. So we've got two variables in my number, one that equals 0, and another one equals 0 as well. So essentially the variables are the same, but they're equal to 0. So we can't do much operations with those. So I'm going to change them to 5 now, so we do something a bit more complex. So we take my number and times it using the asterisk for my number 2. We should be then able to get a simple expression. However, the one problem with this expression is that there's currently nowhere to put the result of that expression. So what we'll do is make a new variable called intAnswer, and we can assign the result of number 1 times number 2 into answer. As you can see, we've got a full expression that now says answer equals my number 1 times my number 2. Now what we can do is, to see if this is working correctly, we can make a message box that will output the value of answer. Now we'll need to convert it, so we'll do a convert to string, and we'll put the argument, or the thing in the braces, as answer. And we'll put a semicolon at the end, and that should now work. So the top bit at the top there is the bit of it controls the variables for a program. They're not really going to do anything now. This bit here will deal with the integers that we're going to do our equation with, which are 2 numbers equal 5 and 1 equals 0. Our other line will be the expression of answer equals my number 1 times my number 2, and that will be printed out via the message box through answer. Now if we run the program, we'll see if we enter something in there. Well, actually don't enter anything in here because that won't actually do anything. Just hit submit, and there you go, you'll get 25 as the answer. So we can see it's working. So as you can see, 5 times 5 obviously equals 25, so we know our program is working. So there's multiple different interactions you can do with different variables. It all depends what you want to do. Now each variable has its own different benefits essentially. Normally speaking, you need to use one, you need to use for each job. So if you're dealing with currency, I suggest you use something like a float or a double. If you're dealing with simple equations like plus and minus, integers will be fine for you. Booleans are more for true or false statements. Multiple different symbols as well. So if you're looking at the time symbol, that is the asterisk. If you're using something, say division, that is the slash. If you're using plus and minus, that's a plus or minus. And that's all it really is. So next tutorial we'll move on to something a bit more complicated and doing some user input, and I look forward to seeing you then.